Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Sit back and relax. Time for another episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll read Chapter 12 of My Life in the Eagles by Don Felder. Chapter 12 is called Hotel California. Alright, the chapter we've all been waiting for. Let's take a look behind the scenes. Here we go. The afternoon was perfect. It was July and I was home for a few days, spending time with my family at our beach house in Malibu while Jessie splashed about in an inflatable wading pool nearby. I had just been for a swim in my cut-off shorts and was still wet, sitting on a couch in the living room, looking out at the sun, glittering on the water, and thinking how incredibly lucky I was. Susan and I had produced 2 healthy, beautiful babies. We were rich beyond our wildest dreams and still very much in love. No matter what happened when I was on the road or in the studio, I never stopped wanting to come home to her and the children, and I fully intended to spend the rest of my life with her. She knew that, and whenever she may have suspected about what went on when I was away, she never once asked. Our wedding vows in Boston 5 years earlier had spoken of cherishing each other and nurturing what we had. Nothing had changed, including how I felt inside. To me, she was still the pretty little blonde with the angel face I first met outside the Howard Johnson Motel in Gainesville. I had fallen for her then, and had never quite picked myself up off the floor. Now here I was, sharing this beautiful life with her, playing music and being paid handsomely for it too. Regardless of the infighting, what we had achieved as a band was pure and bright and true. We had created something far bigger than who we were or how we felt individually. The music we made really touched people. I promised myself never to lose sight of that, and to try my hardest to make the others remember it too. Feeling inspired and picking up an acoustic 12-string guitar I had lying around, I started strumming absent-mindedly while staring out at the ocean, inhaling the fresh, salt air, and before I knew it, a few opening chords just kind of oozed out. I played with them, teased them, pushed them further than they'd ever intended to go, and suddenly had something that sounded pretty cool. It was about 32 bars long with a verse and a chorus, a sparkling little gem that fell out of the spectacular view before me. When I had finished playing, the musical vibrations hung, suspended in the air, before fading into silence. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end. Dwayne Allman was right. If your spine tingles, it's working. I had a little TEAC 4-track studio set up in the spare bedroom, and I ran back there to put the idea down before I forgot it. I wanted a reggae-sounding backbeat, but the closest I had on my drum machine, an old Roland Rhythm Ace, was the cha-cha. So I played the 12-string on top of that. It sounded okay, but I knew I needed to leave it for a while, so I went off to play with my kids and came back to it later. Over the next few hours, I kept tinkering around with it. The tempo was right, but it needed another section and a chorus, the payoff. I tried 3 or 4 different chord progressions, and then finally, I went back down and put a bass track with a reggae feel on it. If Joe and I had to do this, I thought, how would we play it? I was working to an exact cast, thinking of each band member's strengths and weaknesses, trying to find just the right arrangement. With Joe on board, it was a new challenge for me to come up with parts that would outdo him, against which he could retaliate and come back with something that was equal to or one up to me. I knew I couldn't write a complicated drum track for someone who was singing too, but I could write a song that suited Don's voice, and one that Randy could provide a good bass backbeat to. Joe, Glenn, and I could take center stage and blow the audience away with some haunting guitar solos, I thought. So I wrote 2 guitar parts in descending harmony, a horn line sort of thing, until I got to the end, alternating them the way my dad had taught me when he had me count 1, 3, 5, 7, then 2, 4, 6, 8 on my little Voice of Music tape recorder. By the end of the afternoon, when I had mixed the whole thing to mono, there was a little bit of everything that had ever happened to me in that song. There was some Monty Quintet bass, some basic Paul Hillis classic phrasing, some free-form flow-style solos with a bit of Miles Davis thrown in, and some good old Elvis Presley rock and roll guitar. I could imagine the harmonies that would go with it would be very Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and sound positively sun-kissed. It was, I later realized, the soundtrack of my life. The record company was pushing us to get going on the new album. We relocated to a ranch out near Calabasas, just outside Los Angeles, to listen to what new material everyone had and to rehearse. The actual recording was to be done and mixed later by Bill, the Soul Pole, at the record plant in LA and at Criteria Studios in Miami. I had put together a demo cassette with about 10 or 15 different tracks, including that glorious Summer Days offering, fully expecting most of them to be dispatched to outtake heaven by the gods. Some had been milling around in my head that whole summer. Some were even older. I was always tinkering around with sounds, singing into a dictaphone in the car, laying down half-tracks, stray chords, or melodies that ran through my head, hoping that one of them might develop into something. More often than not, when I listened to them later, they were stillborns. The original concept had evaporated, the feeling had gone, and so had the glimpse of inspiration, so I'd erase them and start again. Some people work very methodically at creating music, putting in regular hours, but I can't work that way. I need to feel like it's a lover I haven't seen for a while, and be excited and enthusiastic about our reunion. You can't force inspiration. If there's something in there to be released, it'll find its own way out. We were at the Calabasas Ranch with old wagons in the yard. Photographer David Alexander was taking our photos for the new album sleeve, when Don the Sonic Bat put my demo tape onto a little blaster he had and started listening. Song after song came and went, without much reaction from the Bat Cave, and I was beginning to feel a little dispirited. When the one I wrote that fine day in Malibu came on, however, Don sat up, listened carefully, stopped the tape, rewound, and played it again. I had pretty much worked out the entire arrangement. I added some harmony and electric guitar parts, and the whole thing was underscored by this reggae beat. At the very end, I had 2 guitar solos, trading between a Stratocaster and my favorite 59 Les Paul Starburst, as if Joe and I were going toe-to-toe. I could tell from Glenn's face that he liked that part the best. "Hey, I love this track, Fingers," Don said with a rare smile. "It sounds Spanish, like a matador or something. Very Latino." Glenn nodded his approval. "Yeah." "Oh, good," I said, feeling like a puppy that had just been patted for peeing outside. "Let's call it Mexican Bolero," Don said. "Okay," I said, grinning. The fact that Don had granted it a name was a very good sign. I originally recorded the track in E minor, which was great. The electric guitars were big and fat, and the 12-string sounded nice and full. We continued playing it in that key right up until Don had to sing the lyrics and realized it was too high for him. "It's in the wrong key," he announced. Disappointed, I replied, "Oh, okay. What do you need? D?" "No," he replied, scratching his head. We sat down and eventually decided on B minor, although that's one of the worst possible keys for a guitar. I struggled manfully with the new key, hating every second of it at first, because it sounded so thin and flat compared to the killer E minor sound. The only trouble was, the song was 6 minutes and change with its unusual chromatic progression, and its sudden shift from a minor key to the dominant major key for the chorus. Years of freeform jazz phrasing at jam sessions in Boston had made me slightly overindulgent when it came to track length. Nobody seemed to notice. Best of all, Glenn had a germ of an idea while he was listening to it. He was great at conceptualizing and was listening to a lot of Steely Dan at the time. "This could be about the fantasy of California," he said. "I can see this guy driving down a desert highway at night in a convertible and seeing the lights of LA way off on the horizon." We all knew that feeling. We had all driven from LA from our respective homes and been overwhelmed by the awesome spectacle of the city with its twinkling lights spread out before us. Don snapped the image in his mind and took it from there, expanding it to the guy seeing a hotel in the distance and deciding to rest for the night. There, where he is served pink champagne under mirrored ceilings, a woman walks in. It's such a lovely place, he muses with that uncanny gift of his, as he absent-mindedly adds his smoldering cigarette butt to the dozen he already has lined up in front of him. This could be heaven, or this could be hell. Don was very private about his lyrics. After he'd come up with a basic concept, he'd take it away and work on it secretly, and we wouldn't hear the finished product until we were ready to record it in the studio. No one had any problems with this. After all, he was the lyric king, and we all knew it. The only time I can ever remember all of us daring to jump in and tell him something was wrong was when, in recording one of these nights, he sang that he'd been searching for the daughter of God. Bill Seismic suggested Don might want to change that. Thinking of my mother's devout fellow churchgoers in the Deep South, I agreed he should change it, unless he wanted every religious zealot in the States after him with a gun. The line was later changed to, "I've been searching for an angel in white." We finally figured my new song out, although it took weeks of demos and rehearsals, recording, dubbing, and overdubbing. I taught Randy how to play the complicated bass part, and Don picked up the reggae-style cha-cha beat on its drums. Joe worked out the other guitar solo that he had played against mine at the end, and Glenn learned the rhythm part. When Don first sang his lyrics for us all the way through at the record plant, we were completely stunned. I mean, that guy could sing the New York phone book, and I'd buy it. But this was really something. When the track was finally finished and laid down and given its new name, Hotel California, Don said quietly, "I think this should be the single." "Are you crazy?" I cried as Glenn, Joe, and Randy looked up in mutual astonishment. "This thing's over 6 minutes long. We might have got away with lying eyes, but AM radio won't play anything over 3 minutes 30 seconds, and never anything slow. They also won't play something that stops in the middle, then starts again with a minute and a half of guitar solo. It ain't gonna happen." I had never been more wrong. When Elektra/Asylum asked us to shorten it, Don told them to release it as it was, or not at all. He was right. The final recording and editing of the Hotel California album took place at Criteria Studios, so we rented, among other houses, 461 Ocean Boulevard, Miami Beach, the white stucco beach house made famous by Eric Clapton in his comeback album called 461 Ocean Boulevard, released in 1974. We hoped that by renting the very same house, some of the magic would rub off on us, and we'd make a great record too. We had some of our best times as a band in that place. It was right on the beach, and every Saturday and Sunday we'd lie around the living room watching football on the television, and then during halftime we'd go out and play touch football on the beach. We were all skinny, puny-looking 150-pound guys compared to the bulging muscle men of Miami, but we'd have a game until we got exhausted, then go back in and drink a bunch of beer and watch some more football. It felt for once as if we really liked each other. Much to my delight, while we were there, Don and Glenn chose another of the songs I'd written at the beach house in Malibu. I called it Iron Lung, reminiscent of my childhood illness, because it had a distinctive echo slap on it. They agreed that its rhythmic sound was just like someone wheezing away on a polio ward in the giant cylindrical machine that encased their body, doing their breathing for them. It was merely an idea with no lyrics or melody, but with the help of the gods, it became one of our most recognized songs, Victim of Love. Glenn first came up with the concept. He and I, plus Don and JD, were sitting up late over at Glenn's house one night, drinking and talking through various lyrical ideas about broken hearts, lost dreams, and power and anger in a relationship, all of which those three knew a great deal about. I often wondered if they sometimes deliberately broke off relationships with their various women, just to keep that emotional edge as songwriters. Having a broken heart is like being a victim of a car wreck, JD said brutally, still smarting from his latest split. You wake up all battered and bruised in an emergency room. Victim's a good word, I pointed out. They all nodded their approval. Victim of what, though? I said, brow furrowed. We all sat and pondered. Glenn, sitting quietly in a corner, suddenly spoke. Victim of love. He pretty much took over from there. My hesitant, wheezing iron lung was soon transformed into a hit. Easy as that. Because I wrote the music for that song, and because of the original agreement to try to keep everything as equal as possible, I was supposed to sing the lead vocal. I was more than a little nervous. I can sing okay, but I'll never be in the same league as Don Henley. Still, I thought, I'll give it my best shot. We were in the studios in Miami, and I had drunk some red wine when I went up to the mic and started to sing. I knew my performance wasn't great. Nothing was tingling. Don stepped up and sang, and it was immediately apparent to everyone, especially me, that he should sing it, even though deep down I wasn't thrilled at losing my slot. I just hoped there might be another opportunity later on, but there never was. Joe had come up with a lick, and he, Randy, and I jammed on the idea over at Randy's house one night. It eventually evolved into Life in the Fast Lane. Randy had bought Rick Nelson's old house, which overlooked Universal Studios and had a 360-degree view. He was a big fan of Rick, the singer of hits like Hello, Mary Lou, especially since he played in Rick's Stone Canyon band. I believe the actress Helen Hunt bought the house from Randy afterward and tore it down to build a new one. A shame, because there was so much of Rick in that property. Even his children's painted handprints on the bathroom tiles. Anyway, it was a great place to rehearse, and we were up there jamming and listening to a little cassette machine with Jage Jackson, a terrific roadie who also played drums. "Hey, try this one," I said, playing a lick I had first come up with in Boston. "I've had this one lying around for years, but I never did anything about it." It opened with a raunchy guitar riff and a fast-paced backbeat, but then it fizzled out. Joe listened hard, his head hanging so low that his greasy hair flopped completely over his face, parting only to reveal his bulbous nose. "I have an idea what to do with that," he said suddenly, picking up a guitar. We all worked on it, with Jage adding some nifty drum beats and me contributing a few licks that followed Joe's classic intro, but the song definitely became Joe's. When the demo was done, Joe took it over to Don and Glenn, who rushed away and came up with the concept. Glenn came up with the idea of driving in the fast lane, and he took that idea and expanded on it. I thought it was brilliant, sheer genius to use the spaghetti-like LA freeways as an analogy of what it was like to be in the rock and roll business. Perfect. Don wrote some great lyrics that summed up how people destroy themselves with drugs in the cold city. Lines of cocaine chopped out on a mirror, creating lines on their faces. Pretty cool. It was only when it was almost finished, when they set up the vocal track and Don started singing in that soulful Ray Charles voice of his, that we realized what we'd really achieved. We all thought, wow. Many consider Hotel California to be our finest album, but it wasn't always an easy road to that elusive hotel. Just when we thought the departure of Bernie and the hiring of Joe had cleared the air, the pressure was still on to top the greatest hits album. How do you better your best? It was like raising the high jump bar another few inches, moments after you'd won the gold medal. We worked many days and nights until the wee hours of the morning, squeezing the highest quality out of everyone involved. Whether it was engineering, writing, singing, playing, tracking, or editing, it was all done under the most intense scrutiny. Joe and I had calluses on our calluses. The ultimate goal was to produce the best possible record, but the process was extremely taxing and caused a lot of wear and tear on everyone's nerves. Everyone wanted to set an impeccable standard for Eagles records. In trying to achieve this, however, we often wound up erasing performances that were fiery, motivated, and inspired. If a take had a tiny human glitch, one note out of tune, even if all the rest sounded fine, we'd junk it and do it again. This was before Pro Tools digital editing allowed someone to sit at a computer and insert sounds or fine-tune a few notes. None of that existed then, so we'd have to play the song over and over. Before we knew it, we had squeezed the creativity out of it. We could strive for flawless music, but we couldn't force people to remain flawlessly inspired while delivering 10 or 20 identical takes. The creative process was quickly robbed of its passion. Fresh riffs began to open up, with Randy becoming the new focus of discontent. The sweet-natured, gentlest of men, he was not someone to be easily riled, but every day in the studio, Don in particular seemed to find some reason for criticizing him. Maybe he stayed up too late the night before and was feeling a little the worse for wear, as we all so often did. Maybe he'd been a bit late arriving or wasn't in the most talkative of moods. What was ironic was that Don was the worst of all at being on time. We had this policy of arriving at the studio 2 for 3, between 2 and 3 o'clock. I'd always be one of the first to arrive. I'd help Bill, who dubbed me J.E. for junior engineer, to tidy up a few tracks. Or I'd shoot a few hoops with him outside, or tinker with a guitar, or play pool with Randy or one of the engineers until the rest of the guys showed. We'd play marathon poker games that lasted several days. Eagle poker, where thousands of dollars would be won and lost. One night, I lost $1,800 in one hand to a roadie, and it hurt so much I never played again. We had a saying, hurry up and wait, because you'd hurry to be in the studio on time, and then you'd wait and wait and wait. One by one, the others would arrive, bleary-eyed, disheveled, sniffing or coughing, suffering from the excesses of the previous night. Don would consistently show up at 4 o'clock or later, never with a reasonable excuse. It drove Glenn up the wall. Worse than arriving late, when he finally did get to the studio, he was never in a good mood. One word best describes Don at that time: castigating. He had a constantly critical approach to everything. He had always been a moody perfectionist, guarded with his lyrics and his personal feelings. We never really knew what he was thinking. Randy even slipped him a couple of quaaludes once to see what he'd be like when he was relaxed. They had a great night together, laughing and drinking and getting high, but the next morning Don was right back to his grumpy old self, the persona that had gained him the nickname Grandpa. In the words of Glenn Fry, no one can suck the fun out of the room faster than Don Henley. His perfectionism undoubtedly worked. Look at the end result. Thanks to Don and his assistants on doing everything just so, we produced probably our most brilliant studio album. But the process was much more upbeat now that Joe was on board. He was a high-energy person, and more often than not in those days he was a delight to work with. That was the fun Glenn, the one you wanted to stay up all night with, drinking beers and listening to his stories. When he was like that, he really personified all that we were and wanted to be, a bunch of young guys playing music, having fun, and getting high. With Don's constant insistence on perfection, though, Glenn started to become edgy too. Glenn would do a first take, which sounded great to the rest of us, but Don wouldn't be happy. He'd do it again and again, taking the letter C from one rendition of the word city, as in, city girls just seem to find out early, then the I from another, and the T from a third, and so on, until the final word city was made up of maybe 5 different takes. Bill Seismic was 6'3", and his new nickname became the Big Lopper, because he had to cut and paste so much tape together with a razor blade to make up a final take. There'd be what we called a pile of big whopper droppings all over the control room floor. Don suddenly decided that we hadn't got the guitar parts right on Hotel, and that he wanted to do it exactly as I'd had it when he first heard it on my demo cassette. He was a stickler for that, being just like the demo. The trouble was, we were way down in Miami, and the cassette was back at my beach house in Malibu. "Is Susan home?" he asked, his expression blank. "Of course," I replied. "Then call her up and get her to play it for us over the phone." Poor Susan, who was juggling 2 small children at the time, not only had to find the cassette among all my stuff, she had to get a small blaster, set it up, and play the tape over the phone to Don and Bill, who had recorded it on another cassette in the studio. With that sort of insistence that everything sound flawless, Glenn became more sensitive to exposure than photographic film. He started forbidding anyone from coming into the control room when he was singing, except occasionally Don. We wouldn't be able to hear what he had done until the first comp was made. Only then would we be allowed in to listen and make suggestions and add our parts. It became an agonizingly slow process, taking 5 times as long to make the record as it should have, with tempers being lost along the way. These should have been the best times of our lives, and in many ways they were, but it could have been 100% better. In between takes, Don had become a prolific letter writer. Each letter took him a great deal of time, energy, and effort, but he seemed to feel it was worth it. It was a well-known trait of his, and Don's friend Danny Goldberg at one time had copies of Don's letters hanging in his office. One of the best and most famous letters I clearly remember Don writing was one he had composed to the studio maid, insisting that the floral toilet paper be put on the roll the other way around so it rolled off the top, pointing out that it if it was meant to come off the bottom, the little pink flowers would have been printed on the undersides of the sheets, where you could see them. Whenever I could, I escaped from the studio atmosphere through drugs or alcohol. Oblivion seemed preferable to the nightmare of working in such an intense situation, but heavy cocaine abuse left me and everyone else feeling burned out, which wasn't the best frame of mind for dealing with a highly stressful creative environment. I don't know how many nights I drove back to 461 Ocean Boulevard at 5 or 6 in the morning, with the sun coming up, my shades on, hardly able to stay on the road having been up all night, before falling into bed, knowing I had to do it all again at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Thank the Lord for Joe Walsh. He was the only source of humor. He and Randy and I used to have a blast. We'd take silly videos of each other in the studio, usually while waiting for Don to arrive. We also started playing Cutout Man, snipping pictures from nudie magazines and wrestling magazines, then sticking them together on the wall to make a sort of storyboard collage. Each day there'd be a new picture and a new storyline. Pretty puerile stuff, admittedly, but it whiled away the hours between takes and gave us some laughs. Criteria consisted of 5 studios in a large complex, and anyone who was anyone recorded there. Clapton had just been in, the B's G's were in another studio, and you could walk down the hallway and bump into another face after famous face. One day I went in for a breather and ran into my old friend Stephen Stills in the corridor, coming out of an adjacent studio. "Hey, Don," Stephen cried delightedly when he saw me. "I heard you guys were in town. How you doing?" "Oh, okay," I said, reluctant to tell him the truth. "What's up?" "Just laying down some tracks for a new album," he said. Smiling suddenly, he added, "Why don't you sit in and help me out with some guitar work? I could really do with your input." Always happy to oblige, I went in and jammed with him for a few hours, adding some guitar parts to a couple of tracks. The last time we had played together had been in that surprise gig in Colorado with Crosby and Nash. Before that, it would have been at some teen dance with the Continentals in Gainesville or Palatka, riding there on the Greyhound, or in the back of someone's pickup. We had such fun together in Miami, I'd almost forgotten what it was like to work alongside someone who was just pleased to play music. We talked about the old days in Florida and wondered where friends like Jeff Williams were now. "You remember that time we wrecked that bed in the motel?" Stephen laughed. "Man, we drank some Jack Daniels that night." "Yeah, I remember." It felt good to recall such happy memories with him. They almost made me homesick. Leaving him and wandering back to the Eagles studio, I had to stop and take several deep breaths before bracing myself to step inside. We endured 7 quarrelsome months in Miami, broken only by a concert tour sandwiched between studio sessions. We flew between Miami and our live gigs, sometimes working 24 hours straight. Bill would fly out to where we were playing, let us hear some mixes, get a couple more takes, and then fly back. After what seemed like an eternity, we finally delivered an album that continues to dominate the hearts and charts of America. The Los Angeles Times called it a legitimate rock masterpiece. Besides the title track, it contains several other enduring classics like New Kid in Town, Wasted Time, Try and Love Again, and The Last Resort. Don and Glenn once again dominated the songwriting credits, quite rightly, although I'd come up with Hotel California and Victim of Love, and Randy wrote the words and music for the haunting ballad Try and Love Again. Joe's chief contribution was a song called Pretty Maids All in a Row, and of course the music for Life in the Fast Lane. Irving had negotiated the highest royalty rate in the history of the record business, $1.50 per album. Besides the distinctive opening shot of the Beverly Hills Hotel in silhouette, the sleeve featured wide-angle photographs of us with a group of disparate people posing as surfers and weightlifters, all standing in the lobby of an old Hollywood hotel that once had been the epitome of sophistication, but had become somewhat shabby and more than a little fake, a bit like California. The album sold 500,000 copies a week in the early days, and eventually topped 14 million, remaining one of our best-selling records of all time. On January 14, 1977, 3 weeks after the album's release, we kicked off a world tour in Cleveland, Ohio, with Jimmy Buffett as our opening act. We traveled everywhere by private jet, which became known as the Party Plane, complete with a party pilot and party stewardess. Man, most of the time we were several thousand feet above the atmosphere. Because of the success of Hotel California as a single, we no longer open with the lilting a cappella song Seven Bridges Road. For some reason, we rarely bothered to rehearse it in the shower of the dressing room anymore. I sorely miss that moment of vocal and spiritual harmony. My song, the new album's title track, opened the show each night instead. Every evening I stepped to the front of the stage in the spotlight to play those distinctive chords in front of a backdrop reproduction of the cover, the rest of the band in silhouette. Every night there'd be thunderous applause, and this incredible noise rising out the darkness as the crowd reeled from the shock of that being the opening number. Don's voice would float out from behind the drum riser, strangely disembodied, leading the fans along that dark desert highway, and we'd join him for the chorus and those sun-drenched harmonies. The stadium would explode. I'll never forget that as long as I live. We had a 16mm film made of one of our gigs in D.C. In the movie, there's one part of the final cut where Joe and I are standing toe-to-toe playing the two main guitar parts in Hotel California. Joe's wearing a bandana on his head because he hated to wash his hair. I say something to him, he looks at me, and we start laughing uncontrollably. Scores of people have asked me what it was I said to him that night. Well, what I actually said was, "Hey buddy, you're showing," pretending that he had a white powder ring around his nostrils, captured forever on film. He didn't, but he thought he did, so he said, "Oh, I am?" which set us off laughing. Now you know. One of the other questions I'm asked more than any other is, what is Hotel California really about? For whatever reason, some of the fans have inexplicably read all sorts of hidden demonic messages into the lyrics, citing lines about heaven and hell, stabbing the beast with steely knives, and hearing the mission bell. As far as I'm concerned, I just came up with a reggae-sounding music track that sprang from a glorious summer's day out in Malibu. Glenn and Don came up with the lyrics and the Mexican/Latino concept of an isolated hotel on a dark desert highway that attracts a weary, possibly drugged-out traveler. The elegance and the decadence are inexorably juxtaposed. If Don Henley hadn't been a songwriter, he'd have written poems and sonnets. He is an English literature major, full of fine prose. I have always been in awe of his ability to take a concept and develop it so lyrically that when he sings a couple lines, a whole movie starts rolling inside your head. The way he writes, he allows everyone to see their own version of the story. As they feel the textures of the music, they see images flicker on their own personal movie screens. With that gift in mind, my answer is always the same. It's like life. Hotel California is whatever you want it to be. The tour continued, taking in more than a dozen countries. We were no longer playing as an opening act, but headlining in our own right. This was a serious record. It had propelled us into another league, and we were delighted. In England, we played several sold-out gigs that ensured our future success there. For someone who had started out admiring English bands and copying their style with the Monty Quintet, that felt especially sweet. In the dizzying round of press interviews in London during the tour, several of the music journalists asked me the same question. "We just had another American band playing here," they said, "and their lead singer claims you first taught him how to play guitar. Did you?" "Really?" I said, bemused. "What was his name?" "Tom Petty," they replied. "He's on a world tour with his band, the Heartbreakers. They're going down very well." Little Tommy Petty from Gainesville. I could hardly believe it. Susan flew out and joined me in places like London, Paris, and Tokyo to indulge in some serious retail therapy and to allow me to spend some precious time with Jessie and Rebecca. Aside from those snatched moments of happiness, however, the grueling nature of what we were doing began to take its toll. Dawn had long suffered from stomach ulcers, as had Randy and Glenn to a lesser degree, but now he began to have some serious back pain as well, after years of leaning over a drum kit. His on-tour masseuse realigned his spine nightly, but the pain didn't improve his mood. One of the things that bothered him was the addition of Joe Walsh's drummer to the tour. Joe Vitale could play better drums than Don Henley with an arm and a leg cut off. He also played keyboards and flute and was a welcome addition to our stage sound. With him providing the basic beat, Don could concentrate on his singing. Vitale also gave us a backup for the times when Don stepped off the drum riser to the front of the stage. For some reason, though, he saw Joe Vitale as a threat, a direct criticism of his competence as a drummer. He knew Joe Walsh wanted Vitale to be a permanent member of the band, and his simmering resentment, coupled with his health problems, caused him to flare up over the smallest issue. In Montreal, when there was a screw-up on a hotel reservation, Don blamed our longtime road manager, Richie Fernandez, and ordered him fired. Irving duly obliged, claiming that Richie was a pothead, no longer doing his job properly. Poor Richie, who had been a devoted member of the crew from day one, was given his papers. Ironically, he ended up working as Tom Petty's road manager instead. The firing led the remaining crew, already unhappy with the atmosphere, to dub the tour Prison California. Glenn's power struggle with Don wasn't eased by the fact that Don's creative ability with his writing and singing had just exploded in the previous couple of years. Having held himself back during the early albums, he suddenly became the driving force in lyrics and concepts and music, making everybody else's offerings pale by comparison. The consequence was that we suddenly had two presidents vying for the same position. Don would usually back down in the end, knowing that to push Glenn too far would be unwise. But when they had one of their cocaine-induced arguments, the clouds descended. It affected everyone, even the road crew. Between gigs, Don would sit silently in his part of the Learjet and Glenn in his. Hotel California, the single, shot to number 1 in March of 1977. It spent 15 weeks in the charts and became our most successful single ever, outshining The Best of My Love and One of These Nights. Its success pushed sales to an even higher level. Worldwide, at our peak, we were selling 1 million albums a month, but the growing tour was also taking me away from my family once more. Susan understood that, whether it was 10 days or 10 months out of the year, I had to do whatever the band said. I had no control over scheduling. Furthermore, I was powerless to plead for more time off with my family. Susan never told me, "You gotta come home and help me raise these kids." She never made me feel I had to quit to be part of our home life, and I really appreciated that. I rarely called her with problems. I didn't want to contaminate her life with any Eagles melodrama. When we finally stopped touring, she'd always ask, "Well, how was it?" By then, 3 or 4 days would usually have passed and I'd have decompressed. I could just about describe the latest power struggle without raising my voice. But this latest tour was going to take all my powers of decompression to get over, as the screws were tightened up a notch. Randy and Joe were both big Chuck Berry fans and started to do his famous duck walk on stage. Don berated them both. Joe let it slide, but Randy was furious that Don had addressed him in this manner. Randy hated any sort of confrontation. He lost many battles by attrition, but inside he was festering. The gradual power shift bothered him enormously. He had been in the band right from the start, just like Bernie, and he didn't think it was right that Don and Glenn should automatically assume the reins. As I remember venting his own frustrations, Joe decided to trash a hotel in Chicago. He was clearly drunk, and I helped him. Joe's fiancée was on tour with us at the time and had brought her parents along. The late Steve Wax, then executive vice president of Warner/Elektra/Asylum, mischievously introduced them to several groupies. Joe went crazy. He and I went up to Steve Wax's room while he was in bed with one of the groupies and tore that place apart. Joe smashed crystal decanters, then pulled some sort of knife or tool from his belt. I don't recall exactly what it was, but he stabbed at pictures and furniture and walls. He tore the drapes down and covered himself with them for protection, while he smashed the chandelier with a leg he'd broken off of the grand piano bench, which was collapsed in pieces on the floor. He was a one-man wrecking crew, destroying paintings and Persian carpets, even ripping the fabric wallpaper off the walls. I mostly stood there watching and laughing, although I did take gleeful delight in hurling a table lamp into the fireplace. Steve Wax eventually ran in naked and stoned, the groupie holding a towel to cover herself behind him. There wasn't very much he could do. We were the biggest act on his label, and he knew he'd up. During the second leg of the domestic tour in Knoxville, Tennessee, Randy's ulcers flared up and he was sick with the flu. Don complained it was because he was having too many late nights. Maybe, maybe not. Either way, we had been touring for 11 months straight without much of a break, and everyone was starting to feel the strain. At this particular concert, the audience wanted to hear "Take It to the Limit" sung by Randy, but Randy told Glenn, "No way, not tonight." Randy had one of the best voices in the band. He made women scream when he sang that ballad in his 10-year voice. Hitting the high note at the very end guaranteed an almost deafening round of applause, sometimes for several minutes. Glenn once called it the ribbon of our package, and it was certainly one of the highlights of the show. But for whatever reason, Randy felt uncomfortable in the spotlight. On stage, he'd always grab his microphone and pull it back by his bass amp. He'd stay by the piano, away from the front. When he was singing, he refused to have a spotlight on him. He'd only allow blue light. He'd stand in profile by the piano and sing with his eyes pressed shut as if hiding from the audience. For me, it feels like standing on the railroad track in front of a freight train, the spotlight on the train bearing down on me. He told me privately, I can't stand it, man, I just can't. I get all nervous and sweaty and I just want to run from it. Glenn was furious. I have to stand in front of the stage and sing Take It Easy in a white spotlight. Don does the same for Hotel California. That's show business. You should just stand in front of the stage and sing that song. Glenn was right. Everyone had to cope with the spotlight, and he was probably only trying to persuade Randy into doing it for his own good, but he didn't go about it the right way. Man, he got into this big fight with Randy. The two of them started arguing constantly over exactly where Randy should stand, what color the spotlight should be, and how he should sing. Some nights, like when he was ill, Randy would refuse to sing the high note on the end. Sometimes he wouldn't sing the song at all. He'd tell Glenn, I don't feel like it. Not tonight. Glenn would explode. You got to. It's in the show. They want to hear you sing. The fans expect it. Randy was usually easygoing, but he'd reply, I ain't doing it. My throat doesn't feel good tonight. He'd say to me afterwards, who the appointed Glenn Fry leader of the Eagles? There had been fewer and fewer band meetings of late, and more closed-door meetings between Irving, Glenn, and Don, leaving everyone else out of it. The band spent too much time fighting over stupid stuff. What publicity photographs would be used, whether somebody was doing something without clearance, or which hotels we should stay in. All of it seemed to inflame an already irritable situation. For Irving, Glenn, and Don were the chief singers and songwriters, and as far as he was concerned, they were running the show. They had been natural allies from the start, and now that alliance was taking over. Since Irving paid a great deal of attention to their likes and dislikes, whatever they wanted usually happened. Whatever anyone else wanted was secondary. We were the country cousins. Irving made a show of trying to appease us, but we knew our opinions were irrelevant. After a series of closed-door meetings with Irving and Don, Glenn would emerge to hand decisions down and dictate what they expected. Randy was tired of it. He was also getting static from his wife. He lived in L.A. because of work, but his wife and 4 kids were still back home in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, and the distance between them was getting harder for them both. Randy had married Jennifer right after high school, and they had a lot of history together. Ultimately, Randy had to reach a difficult decision, the band or his family. We were in Memphis in the summer of 1977 when he chose the latter. It began as a memorable night for another reason. We were supposed to be going over to Graceland to meet Elvis Presley. Someone had set it all up for us, and we were just waiting on a call. When it came at almost midnight, it wasn't what we had hoped for. The king isn't feeling so good tonight, one of his handlers told us. He'd love to meet you next time you're in town, but he's not taking any visitors today. Within a few weeks, Elvis was dead. His years of drug abuse were finally too much for his heart. He was 42 years old. After the news came through that we weren't going to Graceland after all, Joe, Randy, and I got high on Jack Daniels and cocaine and stayed up all night trying to convince Randy not to leave. You don't want to do this, man, I told him, not financially, musically, or career-wise. Imagine what it would be like having to start over. I've been out there on my own, Joe told him glumly, and it's no picnic. We tried every which way to convince Randy not to quit, but he was adamant. By 6 in the morning, we had exhausted every possibility. Randy had pretty much made up his mind. The crunch came 2 days later when Glenn and Randy got into another fight during the intermission about where Randy should stand on stage for the encore. It was the same old argument, and we expected the same outcome, but this time, it was different. Stop being such a Glenn yelled. Before we could stop him, Randy had Glenn up against a wall, while security guards and the rest of us tried to pull him off. It surprised me beyond words. Glenn had somehow pushed Randy to the point that this gentle, easygoing guy who wouldn't hurt a fly flipped. He was probably the most difficult person in the world to drive to that point. It was scarily reminiscent of what had happened with Bernie. As soon as the two brawling men had been separated, and while the guards continued to restrain a struggling Randy, Glenn grabbed a dirty towel, wiped the sweat off his face, walked right up to Randy and threw it in his. That was the final straw. Randy decided there and then to retire back to Scottsbluff and raise his kids, tired of being dominated in a band that had started off being a lot more fun. He stayed only until the final date on the Hotel California tour. The gods were taking the reins, and those that opposed them were either expelled or driven out. In the 18 months I had lost my two best friends in that band, Bernie, that fiery streak of brilliance, and gentle Randy, the sweetest man in the music business. I was truly on my own now. Well, that completes Chapter 12. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 12 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.